Good morning, Mr. Shabazz. I'm not sure if you're at your keyboard right now. This is the Transportation Committee staff. When you have a chance, would you mind giving us a quick mic and video check just to make sure everything's working sound? Thank you, sir, in advance.
Hello, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Perfect. Can hear you loud and clear, sir, and can see you loud and clear as well. Thank you very much for that.
Wonderful, thank you.
Anytime, much appreciated. Good morning, Ms. Wilson. This is the Transportation Committee staff. Can see that you're logged in. When you have a chance, would you mind giving us a quick mic and video check just to make sure everything is working sound? Thank you very much in advance.
Shelby Wilson.
Perfect. Thank you very much, sir. Much appreciated.
Did I accidentally log into Parliament or?
They managed to find the one New Zealand American citizen, Congressman. Sorry about the confusion.
Congresswoman Norton, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, ma'am. Thank you very much for double checking, Congresswoman.
I'll be doing one more check also just because I zoomed in and out again.
Loud and clear, ma'am, but thank you for double checking. And thank you for logging in as well, Mr. Lopez. Can see you loud and clear. Would you mind giving us a quick mic check just to verify?
Hey everyone, good morning.
Loud and clear. Thank you very much, sir.
Good morning. I call this hearing to order. Today's hearing highlights the historic levels of investment for the cleanup of contaminated and toxic waste sites that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill signed by President Biden last month. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to significantly improve the pace of toxic cleanups, to provide increased protection for human and environmental health, and to ensure this investment benefits all communities, especially rural and small communities that have been disproportionately borne the burden of toxic contamination in the past. Let me begin by asking unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. And without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted unless speaking. Should I hear any inadvertent noise, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. These are very historic times in Congress. Just a few weeks ago, President Biden signed into law the single largest investment in our nation's infrastructure ever. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or JOBS Act, provides once-in-a-lifetime investment that will modernize our roads, bridges, transit, ports, and airports, as well as our critical water and wastewater systems. We all know that the neglect that our critical infrastructure has faced over the years due to the short-sighted budget reductions under the previous administration or through the lack of available resources from our state and local partners. However, that continued neglect is now over, and thanks to the courage of members on both sides of the aisle, thank you, Mr. Rouser, infrastructure investment help is now on the way. This is especially true for the critical infrastructure under the jurisdiction of the Subcommittee of Water Resources and Environment. The JOBS Act provides over $12.7 billion in critical infrastructure assistance to states and local communities to rebuild their crumbling wastewater systems, and authorizes the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, the SRF, for the first time in its 34-year history. Just as important, more than half of this assistance is provided as grants, responding to the direct testimony of rural, small, and economically disadvantaged communities that testified before this committee on their struggles to afford critical wastewater upgrades. The JOBS Act provides the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, known as ACE, with additional $17.1 billion to carry out crucial construction and operation and maintenance activities on critical water resources development projects throughout the nation. This committee, on a bipartisan basis, has now completed work on the 4 Water Resources Development Acts in a row and will begin work on the 5th early next year. However, all of the projects authorized in WRDAS need appropriated funds for communities to realize the full navigation, flood control, environmental benefits that these projects provide. The $17.1 billion in the JOBS Act will quickly bring many of these critical water resources projects into reality. Finally, and central to the theme of today's hearing, passage of the JOBS Act, when combined with the Build Back Better Act, provides billions to clean up the nation's most toxic, hazardous waste dumps and to make sure polluters pay to clean up their mess. First, the JOBS Act provides a total of $1.5 billion to assess, remediate our nation's brownfields. These underutilized sites in big cities and small towns where contamination or the threat of contamination limits full use of these properties. This is the most significant investment in federal brownfields cleanup funding in its 20-year history and will finally allow for the redevelopment of properties that have languished for years, simply waiting for critical cleanup funds. Second, just as important, the JOBS Act, when combined with the Build Back Better Act, will provide additional $30 billion to clean up America's most contaminated Superfund sites, finally bringing relief to urban and rural neighborhoods that have had to live with these legacy toxic waste dumps for decades. And these combined bills will finally restore the polluter pays concept of Superfund cleanup, making sure that polluters, not the taxpayers, pay the cost of cleaning up toxic contamination. I am proud to support these historic investments in brownfields and Superfund cleanups, which will rejuvenate neighborhoods, will protect the health of our families, our neighbors, our environment, and will start to undo the toxic legacy of the past. However, now that these funds are available, it is equally critical that these investments benefit families and neighborhoods of all economic means in rural and urban areas, in minority and tribal communities, and in every geographic area of this country. Today, this is the focus of today's hearing, listening to stakeholders on how we can improve the EPA's Brownfields program. This program has, by most accounts, been successful in redeveloping many unutilized and underutilized brownfield sites. However, if you dig a little deeper, there are questions about whether all communities have benefited from this critical redevelopment investments and whether this investment will actually benefit those who have had to suffer the legacy of contamination for decades. Today, we will hear from stakeholders representing an array of viewpoints on successes of the brownfield programs and should hear who has benefited and who may have been left behind. As we stand on the cusp of significant increases in brownfields and Superfund clean investment, it is critical that all these voices be heard. We need to ensure that the historic funds in the Job Act and the Build Back Better Act are used to help all communities realize a future without toxic contamination, and to ensure that these funds benefit all communities, both rural and urban, especially those that have been overlooked or passed over for critical reinvestment funds in the past. At this time, I'm pleased to use my colleague, the ranking member of our subcommittee, my good friend, Mr. Rouses, for any thoughts you may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and I would also like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing will examine contaminated properties known as brownfields, the tools the Environmental Protection Agency has to address them, and what we hope to accomplish with those tools. There are hundreds of thousands of brownfield sites in America in both rural and urban areas. They are often prime locations for redevelopment, except for the fact, of course, that the land may have some contamination. Brownfields drive down property values, decrease tax revenues, and are a blight on many of our cities and towns. In the past, few wanted to invest in cleaning up these sites because they feared liability, and rightfully so. As a result, many developers turned to undeveloped green spaces for new investments and development. It became clear that it made good economic environmental sense to remove legal roadblocks and support state, local, and private efforts to clean up and redevelop brownfields. Through this committee's efforts, the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act became law in early 2002, which the committee updated in 2018 with the Brownfields Utilization Investment and Local Development Act. The law provided legislative authority for the Brownfields program, including grants for site assessments and cleanup. The law also clarified liability issues and helped provide greater protections for those who have had no history with contamination of the brownfields property and want to clean up and redevelop it. Turning brownfields back into usable property involves the efforts of the EPA, state and local governments, developers, and non-governmental organizations. The Brownfields program, codified in 2002, is itself built on another pivotal environmental law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, known by its acronym of CERCLA, which is also commonly referred to as Superfund. Passed by Congress in 1980, Superfund provides the basis for federally overseen cleanup of environmentally damaged sites. In addition to funding cleanup efforts, the program provides a liability framework that has enabled needed environmental remediation to be done. I look forward to the testimony today to learn how to improve the Brownfields and Superfund programs, and specifically how they affect the local economies of communities and the lives of the people who live in and near those communities. Again, thank you to our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser, very much for your testimony. And now I'm pleased to yield to the chair of the committee, Mr. DeFazio, for any thoughts he may have.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for calling this hearing to highlight just some of the critical investments in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. You know, this committee twice passed the bill called INVEST, a comprehensive approach to rebuilding America's infrastructure. We went through a real legislative process. In the end, we were given a Senate product written behind closed doors, but I think we pushed the envelope a lot. The numbers are not quite as high as what we had, but they are historic and will provide for a tremendous amount of activity. You know, we're not done yet in terms of Build Back Better and additional policies in there and the potential for implementation policies of the vast amount of money in this bill to better address some of the concerns this committee had that did not make it into the final cut. But, you know, today we're here to talk about those issues within the purview of the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee. The first is the first reauthorization of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program in 34 years. You know, things don't happen quickly around here. This is my 35th year, and I'm retiring next year. It'll be 36. But that was passed in my first term and has never been reauthorized. And it's a critical program for the states to deal with their wastewater issues in partnership with the federal government. You know, that alone is pretty big news, but the bill also provides $12.7 billion in new wastewater infrastructure funding over 5 years for states, municipalities, to directly help communities large and small. And even better, this is different and historic. About half that funding will be provided in the form of grants. There are many communities out there, relatively small communities, without an income or tax base that could support, you know, the costs of these new systems. And the combination of grants and funding will make it affordable and will make it more widely available. We also have inclusion investments for the utilities, the wastewater utilities, to recapture, reuse their methane. It can be reused directly as a fuel. You know, that way it's prevented from being vented into the atmosphere in a more damaging form. One utility who testified before the committee a few years ago in New Jersey is generating all the electricity they need for their newly refurbished plant and selling onto the grid and making money and saving the ratepayers from higher costs. You know, this is a win for the constituents and the environment. National utility contractors estimates every billion in SRF funding produces 28,000 new jobs. That'll mean roughly 350,000 new jobs over the term of this bill for the working men and women who will be doing much needed construction and repair of our wastewater systems. And today the hearing, though, is focused on brownfields and Superfund programs, two programs that were created to clean up legacy toxic contamination. You know, the Jobs Act has some big wins there too, providing billions for both programs, finally address the backlog of remediation projects throughout the country. Right now, the EPA can only fund about 1 in 4 local brownfields cleanup project applications, and that's a result of chronic underfunding. The EPA states that every federal dollar invested in brownfields assessment and cleanup leverages over $20 in private sector investment, and every $100,000 in EPA brownfields expended leverages around 10.3 jobs. That's pretty darn efficient, and when you're accomplishing a goal and creating economic activity that inexpensively. That means 1.5 billion brownfields contained in the Jobs Act can be expected reasonably to generate $30 billion in additional private sector investment in brownfields properties and create 150,000 new jobs associated with the reuse of those properties. Similarly, the Superfund program, which will provide over $30 billion in additional remediation funds, and finally restore the polluter pays principle for Superfund cleanup that was allowed to languish many years ago under Republican control. Superfund was enacted with the premise that polluters should be required to pay for the cleanup of their messes, not the taxpayers. But over the years, that has devolved to where the polluters aren't paying, and many times you can't find a responsible party. So the taxpayers are paying. That's not right. So this bill is going to right that wrong and begin to deal with some of these very hazardous sites. So this will bring a lot of relief to communities across the nation who have been forced to wait in line for the small annual appropriated trickle of cleanup funds. Madam Chair, the Jobs Act, Build Back Better Act, filled with programs directly benefit health, safety, quality of life for American families. And just looking at the two programs we're going to look at today, and I've discussed this morning, clean water and brownfields, this investment will create close to 1 million jobs. I welcome our witnesses here today and look forward to the rest of the hearing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio, and I need to thank you personally because you've been a great leader and certainly have made it easier for me to work on the water and the infrastructure. But without your leadership for the whole committee and my committee, subcommittee, thank you very much, sir. Now we will move on to the introduction of witnesses. Thank you very much. You will now proceed to hear from them who are prepared to testify. I ask the witnesses to please turn their cameras on and leave them on for the duration of the panel. Thank you for being with us and welcome. On today's panel, we have the Honorable Lucy Vennis, Mayor of Eugene, Oregon, Mr. Michael Goldstein, Chairman of the National Brownfields Coalition, Committee on Public Policy and Redevelopment Incentives and Regulatory Partnerships, Ms. Susan Bodine, Partner, Earth and Water Law, Dr. Jacoby Wilson, sorry if I murder your name, Associate Professor and Director, Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health, Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health at the University of Maryland's School of Public Health. Mr. Jerome Shabazz, Executive Director, Overbrook Environmental Education Center, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Mr. Mark Lopez, Eastside Community Organizer and Special Projects Coordinator, East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, Commerce, California. Without objection, your prepared statements will be entered into the record, and all witnesses are asked to limit their remarks for 5 minutes. Mayor? Yes, I would like to have Mr. DeFazio please take the mic and introduce the mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I'd just like to take a minute to introduce the mayor of the city of Eugene, largest city in my district, sister city to Springfield, where I live. Lucy has managed, and it's not easy to get Springfield and Lane County and Eugene all on the same page, to put together two very successful brownfield cleanup programs, and being recognized for her success and her advocacy and her work. She has been named by the president to the local government advisory committee on these issues. So I'm certain her testimony today will get into some of that. So Lucy, welcome to the hearing. A little early there, but appreciate your doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Without objection, your prepared statements will be entered into the record. And again, all witnesses are asked to limit their remarks for 5 minutes. Mayor Vennis, welcome, and you may proceed.
Good morning, Chair DeFazio and Chair Napolitano and members of the committee. I am Lucy Vennis, Mayor of Eugene, Oregon, and I am here with you today to testify about Eugene's experience with the Environmental Protection Agency's Brownfields Assessment Grant Program. As you know, the Brownfields Assessment Grant Program provides funding for local communities to assess contaminated properties with the end goal to put these sites back into productive use. It is a critical resource for local governments to address sites with unknown contamination levels, and the City of Eugene and our regional partners were grateful that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act law included $1.5 billion in new brownfields funding to help address the backlog of important projects. Eugene received EPA funding in 2012 and 2017. Together with Lane County and the City of Springfield, our Brownfields Coalition was awarded grants to conduct scientifically based assessments of vacant urban and rural sites to determine if and to what extent contamination existed. During the grant period, we funded 54 environmental assessments and developed 4 cleanup plans covering 37 brownfield sites in the region. Here are a few examples of this work. First, one of the largest sites is on Eugene's downtown riverfront, a 17-acre development site which lies along the Willamette River and is walking distance to our downtown and the University of Oregon campus. We used the EPA grant to test for contamination throughout this former industrial site. Now remediated, the site is being transformed to include a new world-class park, infrastructure for market rate and affordable housing, and commercial development. In July 2022, it will host our Riverfront Festival as part of the Oregon 22 World Track and Field Championships. Second, our first EPA grant came on the heels of the Great Recession and kicked off a multi-party effort to redevelop a group of surface parking lots in our downtown. The area is now home to a new 5-story affordable housing complex, a market rate apartment building, a hotel, and commercial retail and office space. It provides housing within walking distance to services, primary employment centers, and transit. Lastly, we used assessment grant funds to redevelop a former auto repair shop into the University of Oregon's Innovation Hub, a space that anchors the region's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Funds also supported the redevelopment of a 60-year-old parking garage into a new pavilion under construction right now that will be a permanent and all-weather home for our farmers market, providing economic support to small farmers across the region. The Brownfields Assessment Program is a valuable federal tool because it is focused, well-managed, with clear expectations and straightforward objectives. As a member of the Climate Mayors Steering Committee, a member of Mayors and CEOs for Housing Investment, and a newly appointed member of the EPA's Local Government Advisory Committee, I believe this program helps cities meet 3 critical objectives: to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through incentivizing reuse of urban sites, to advance housing equity by creating an opportunity to redevelop derelict properties, and to support environmental justice efforts by remediating polluted sites that disproportionately impact neighborhoods that are home to low-income residents and communities of color. In a bipartisan world, the Brownfields Assessment Grant Program has broad support from both conservative and progressive voices. That said, I must add that while the infusion of brownfields funding in the infrastructure bill will make a big impact, the communities needing this investment still exceed the grant availability. Additionally, assessment funds are only the first step. Contaminated sites also need remediation funding before they can be redeveloped. With that in mind, I ask this committee to engage the Biden administration and EPA leadership to increase the number and size of both assessment and remediation grants to local governments as soon as possible. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not also mention the extraordinary support that EPA staff has always provided with this program. Our Region 10 contacts and staff at the national headquarters have always ensured that local governments are informed, supported, and kept engaged on the program opportunities and implementation. Thank you for allowing me time to share Eugene's experience, and thank you for your service to our great nation.
Thank you, Ms. Venice. It's very welcome report that you have given, and we will now proceed to Mr. Goldstein. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and subcommittee members. My name is Michael Goldstein. I'm the managing partner of the Goldstein Environmental Law Firm, a principal in the environmental redevelopment venture Goldstein Kind Environmental, a charter member and former president of the Florida Brownfields Association, and chair of the National Brownfield Coalition's Public Policy, Redevelopment Incentives, and Regulatory Partnerships Committee. It's an honor to be here today providing testimony, and the coalition thanks you for the opportunity. My remarks today are presented in my capacity as a representative of the coalition and informed by 3 decades of experience assisting businesses, local governments, and community stakeholders reuse contaminated sites. Much of this work occurs in communities of color disproportionately burdened by human health risk, financial disinvestment, failing infrastructure, inequitable access to medical facilities and fresh produce providers, and the crush of economic gentrification and climate gentrification. In a letter sent to the nation's governors this past Thursday, and referring to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the EPA administrator stated the law's investment in water is nothing short of transformational. We concur, and we're grateful for the $1.5 billion investment in EPA's Brownfields program. The money will be catalytic and the delivery vehicle for much of the remediation that occurs of the most impaired water resources in the most disproportionately impacted neighborhoods across the land. EPA currently estimates, as we've heard, that every dollar it expends on brownfields revitalization leverages $20.13 in additional spending. Accordingly, Congress's commitment to brownfields should inject over $30 billion into the country's portfolio of impaired, underutilized properties. As impressive as this outcome is, our lived and professional experience tells us that the need in communities across the country is greater still, likely by at least 2/3. So we encourage an even higher magnitude of investment in brownfields funding at the community level through EPA's competitive grant process, especially insofar as such grants can be targeted to accelerate restoration of drinking and surface water for consumption, irrigation, and recreation. We are broadly supportive of the administration's Justice 40 initiative, which we believe will and should direct a windfall of federal resources to overburden and marginalized communities. We encourage swift completion of the applicable regulations and commencement of funding at the earliest practical time. We also ask this committee to focus the executive agencies under its oversight to place an emphasis on concentrating resources on impaired sites that drain economic opportunity from neighborhoods and acutely impair water resources and water infrastructure with lead, PFAS, and other contaminants of concern giving rise to cancer risk and developmental impairment. For over 15 years, the coalition has advocated for reauthorization of the Brownfields Redevelopment Tax Incentive, which allows parties conducting voluntary cleanup on sites subject to redevelopment to deduct corresponding costs in the year they were incurred. Accordingly, we offer our unqualified support for HR 4427, the Brownfields Redevelopment Tax Incentive Reauthorization Act. This legislation, if history is a guide, will likely result in a massive public investment in the remediation of water resources and the enhancement of water infrastructure. There is a unique opportunity to utilize current and future increased investment in brownfield cleanup and reuse to increase training and funding opportunities in the new green economy for the unemployed and the underemployed. We encourage the subcommittee to consider a major increase in resources for such environmental workforce training programs and future legislation, especially as such training can provide the many tens of thousands of new workers across the country who will be needed to improve the nation's water quality and water delivery infrastructure and impaired sites undergoing remediation and redevelopment. The coalition would like to see the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with its vast expertise and experience in civil works projects involving remediation, take a much more active role in the federal brownfields partnership. The subcommittee should undertake an analysis of this technical and funding support that the Corps can provide directly to developers and local governments in need of such assessment when tackling brownfield projects that will result in remediation of water resources and/or enhancement of water infrastructure. We also encourage the committee to explore ways in which the Corps can be directed to develop, with broad stakeholder input, a meaningful brownfields action agenda patterned on such long-range plans issued previously by US EPA. Finally, the coalition strongly affirms that a cornerstone of creating equity for those living in environmentally overburdened and economically disadvantaged communities, disinvested communities, is access to affordable housing. Additional targeted funding for such use should be among the highest of Congress's concerns, as it often involves remediation of water resources and enhancement of water infrastructure. To this end, the subcommittee should consider legislation that would increase the 4% and 9% low-income housing tax credit to 6% and 12%, and create a one-time low-income housing tax credit in the amount of 80%, of the cost of land acquisition to develop affordable housing on brownfield sites requiring remediation of water resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Goldstein, for your testimony. And we will now proceed to Ms. Bodine. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chair Napolitano and Chair DeFazio, Ranking Member Rouser, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today on promoting economic and community redevelopment and environmental justice in the revitalization and reuse of contaminated properties. I'm currently a partner with Earth and Water Law. I previously worked on the Superfund and Brownfields programs, both as staff of this subcommittee and as staff of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I also have previously served at EPA at both the what's now the Office of Land and Emergency Management, as well as the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, both of which offices have significant roles in implementing these programs. I'm here in my personal capacity. So my goal today is to help the subcommittee understand EPA's Superfund and Brownfields programs. Now, my written testimony goes into detail about how both of these programs have been tremendously successful in helping communities adversely affected by contamination. But I just want to use my time to highlight a few points. First, from an EPA perspective, it's always preferable to use other people's money to secure cleanups. That leaves EPA's dollars for orphan sites. And EPA has authorities. They can encourage people to clean up property by using the incentives and seed money provided in the Brownfields program. EPA can force cleanups using the liability provisions of the Superfund statute. And then finally, EPA can facilitate cleanups through the settlement agreements, prospective purchaser agreements with redevelopers at both Brownfields and Superfund sites. These agreements provide liability protection. Remember, Brownfield sites are by definition sites that pose less of a risk than your Superfund national priority sites. And by definition, these are sites that are not required to be cleaned up under other EPA programs like corrective action. That means the Brownfields program doesn't use liability or regulation to get cleanups, it uses incentives. And without private investment, those cleanups wouldn't happen. EPA does not select brownfield remedies, and cleanups at brownfield sites are governed by state law. EPA's grant agreements include requirements that cleanups be protective of human health and the environment, comply with all state and federal laws, and meet Superfund standards where relevant and appropriate. In contrast, the Superfund program is federally directed. At the national priority sites, EPA decides which sites are cleaned up and what the remedy should be. And EPA at the NPL sites has authority to use federal dollars to do the cleanups, whether or not there's a private party involved. However, just like brownfields, EPA doesn't control land use. At any redevelopment of a property, whether it's brownfields, whether it's Superfund, that's a local government decision. People like Mayor Vinnis and her other local government officials are the ones who make those decisions. Now, both brownfields and Superfund are very sensitive to environmental justice issues. If you look at EPA's grant criteria for brownfields, their criteria include factors like whether the grant will identify and reduce threats to children, pregnant women, minority or low-income communities, or other sensitive populations, the extent to which the grant provides for involvement of the local community in making decisions about the cleanup and the future use of the property, and then, of course, whether or not there are disproportionately high adverse effects related to exposure to hazardous substances. Both the Brownfields program and the Superfund program have authorities and have tools to help community members be involved. They have grants that go to like local community groups, and then they have a contract that provides independent technical assistance to local community groups. As may be obvious, when sites are cleaned up, property values do increase, and I cite studies in my written testimony. Both programs also lead to jobs and tax revenues. Chair DeFazio, he cited some very impressive statistics about the leveraging that the Brownfields program provides. And so I'm not going to repeat the studies that are in my written testimony. So I just really want to conclude by saying that, by reiterating that these programs are are well designed to encourage the private investment. And if you're looking at changes, please don't lose sight of that. Don't make changes that will then drive away private investment, and then you won't have those impressive leveraging statistics that Chair DeFazio quoted. I would submit that both programs are doing an excellent job right now of securing health and economic benefits to local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bodine. It's nice to see you, and we will now proceed to Dr. Wilson. You may proceed.
Thank you to the chairs and esteemed members of this committee for this opportunity to provide testimony. My name is Dr. Jacoby Wilson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. I direct the Center of Community Engagement in Environmental Justice and Health. I'm also a former member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, but I'm still a co-chair of the Justice 40 work group, and I have some comments related to Justice 40 as part of this testimony. And I'm also a current or a new member of EPA's Science Advisory Board. So I'm here providing testimony in my role as associate professor. As has been already stated, when you think about issues of environmental justice, we're talking about how some communities, due to race, ethnicity, income, class, geography, may be overburdened by locally wanted land uses and environmental hazards. In this case, we're talking about brownfields and Superfund sites. And so in my testimony, I want to, for those of you who have access to the testimony, just want to highlight in a document that's in a link in my testimony about the brownfields distribution in this country based on race, ethnicity, based on percentage people of color, based on per capita income. If you look at census block groups with EPA funded brownfield properties, the poverty rate is 21.7%. This is from 2019. Compared to the poverty rate at the census block group level across the country being 14.9%. If you look at the percent people of color in those census block groups that have the EPA funded brownfield property, that's 41%, compared to census block groups nationwide of 38%. If you look at per capita income in those block groups where you have EPA funded brownfield property, the per capita income is $26,642. Again, that's in 2019, compared to non-brownfield census block groups of $38,712. So you see disparities in the distribution of these properties. If you look at the characteristics of brownfield sites, when you look at the population around 0.5 miles and 1 mile around these brownfield sites, what you see is more people of color, you see more low income folks, you see more linguistically isolated, and you see people less likely to have a high school education. And so when you think about the distribution of facilities, there's also the potential, some of these brownfields may have contamination that can impact human health. In one study in Baltimore, they found that in areas near brownfield zones, there was higher mortality rates due to cancer, lung cancer, respiratory disease, major causes of health disparities, influenza, and pneumonia. That may not be due to the brownfield itself, but it's due to the cumulative burden of hazards that may be in those neighborhoods that are hosting brownfields. So you have to take into account the cumulative impacts of other uses that create exposure conditions that lead to disparities, and exposure disparities and conditions that lead to health disparities. And there have been studies that have shown differential burden of brownfields based on race, ethnicity, and income. One study by Adam and Keeler, which is in my testimony, found that brownfields were much likely to be located in people of color communities, and especially poor communities, than in higher SES locations. But it's important to note here, they also said that when you look at the initial assessment and planning phase of the cleanup process, you see that in communities of color, the process was slower to clean up compared to non-communities of color that hosted brownfields. So just want to put those points out there. Now the transition to my role as a member of NEJAC, I think it's very important for us to use screening tools like US EPA EJ Screen, the new Justice 40 tool that's been built to make sure that we are identifying, prioritizing, and micro-targeting communities who have the most need of these investments. So we want to make sure that we look at the issues of cumulative impacts, and we look at the issues of differential access to help promote an infrastructure, whether it be food infrastructure or whether it be housing infrastructure. And to do that well, we need to be using the best available screening tools. We need to be able to map these communities and then make sure the investments are getting to these communities and having guardrails to make sure those who've been disinvested and left behind actually are able to get access to the resources and access to job opportunities and access to economic opportunity structures, which other members of this panel will talk about next. So I will pass the mic. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Wilson. I'd be interested to know if you have made studies after remediation, how that has changed the tone of the community. Mr. Shabazz, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Member Rozier, Committee Chair DeFazio, all the committee members, fellow panelists. Thank you for this opportunity to present today, and it's my pleasure and honor. My name is Jerome Shabazz. I'm the founder and executive director of Jazz Tech Development Services, Inc., a not-for-profit organization in Philadelphia, and the Overbrook Environmental Education Center. I'm also privileged to serve on the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Board, as with Dr. Wilson, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection Citizen Advisory Council, Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and the Municipal Environmental Justice Advisory Board here in Philadelphia. The purpose of my testimony today is twofold. One, to share with this committee some of my organization's success with collaborative community partnerships that improved infrastructure and health at the neighborhood level. And two, the ideas of what is needed to promote an equitable and sustainable system for continued infrastructure and economic improvement, particularly in the most vulnerable communities of our nation. This organization's founding in 1997, our mission was clear: to promote environmental and climate justice, use environmental resources as a means to improve public health, establish green career options, and sponsor programs that promote and conserve the built natural environments where our constituents live, work, and play. In 2002, Jazz Tech applied for and received technical support from the EPA to establish the Overbrook Environmental Education Center. This is a neighborhood-based center that's committed to removing barriers to the public access to information to advance the quality of life for residents living in urban settings. Our work was guided by three primary principles of service: one, environmental stewardship; non-formal education for all ages; and three, the removal of derogatory impacts in the community regarding health. We work with a variety of stakeholders. The community that we work in is roughly 43,172 residents, 95% of them are African-American. Our reporting tells us that this Overbrook neighborhood that we work in, 38 out of 46 neighborhoods in Philadelphia, this neighborhood has derogatory impacts that can be identified in the health of our citizens. The other factors that we're really concerned about in this community is that the University of Pennsylvania of Excellence in Environmental Toxicology indicated that aging housing stock, deteriorating infrastructure, and brownfields also pose an ongoing environmental health hazard for this Philadelphia community. Overbrook and West Philadelphia neighborhoods include asthma, lead poisoning, chemical exposure, former industrial sites. The asthma rate in Philadelphia is 2 to 3 times higher than any other county in Pennsylvania. Even the EPA's EJ screen tool for regional environmental indicators indicate that this particular community has higher than greater averages across the city. One of the primary points that I really wanted to address is how the bigger aspects of the work that we're doing is not just impacting environment, but it's impacting people. The properties that we're working on in terms of the remediation is a community adjacent to 61 residential properties. It's approximately 185 people that coexist with this derogatory blight and decay. And they've been doing this for over 50 years. So imagine a child that smelled, breathed, and witnessed blight and how these conditions shape their perspective on life and community. Think about the life cycle of that person, that young person who grew up with their whole worldview and sense of community being associated with trash and blight, pollution, and debris. One of the factors that we want to talk about as a potential solution to all these issues is establishing community capacity building centers that can enable us to process and demonstrate what a multi-level community support system would look like around brownfields. To go to this idea of from brownfields to greenfields and to utilize this whole idea of knowledge building and capacity building in communities to do so. It's an important aspect of our work to go beyond just the physical sense of eliminating properties with, and also work on the ethereal development of communities, development around this work, their capacity to apply for resources, their capacity to apply for grants, their capacity to understand and assess the issues that are affecting their neighborhoods. I want to look at this work, and we talk about brownfields at a neighborhood level in a way that we are able to access all of our community members throughout the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabazz. There was excellent testimony. Mr. Lopez, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair Napolitano, for the invitation to share with you all today. I'm participating in this subcommittee hearing virtually from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva, Quiche, Gabrieleño, specifically the community of East Los Angeles. I also want to acknowledge my grandfather, Ricardo Jesus Gutierrez, who helped lay the groundwork with the Mothers of East LA, Santa Isabel. That makes me qualified to speak before you today. He passed just a week ago. I appreciate the opportunity to speak from the perspective of the experiences of our communities when it comes to the revitalization and reuse of contaminated lands, with the focus on threats, opportunities, and the importance of engaging communities. My name is Mark Lopez, and I am a member of East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. I also currently serve as the East Side Community Organizer and Special Projects Coordinator. East Yard is a movement based in the communities of the East Side, Southeast Los Angeles, Long Beach, and surrounding communities. We focus on building well-informed and well-equipped self-advocates for the self-determination of our communities. We recognize that many of the harms our communities have historically faced and continue to deal with are because of the planning of public agencies and private entities without our consent or involvement, intentionally and unintentionally. It's important to understand that toxic cleanup can actually reproduce harm. Federal investment in the cleanup of contaminated sites isn't the end of the story for our communities. While this type of investment has the potential to boost economic opportunity and community cohesion, it can also just reopen real estate for the development of new toxic facilities. Seaport and inland port communities across the country are especially vulnerable given the takeover of our communities by large-scale warehousing. Job-dense career hubs have been transformed into indoor parking lots with low-wage temporary work, driving up real estate costs while robbing our communities of economic opportunity and contaminating us with thousands of toxic truck trips a day. In some cases, we've even had to fight off lowest hanging fruit projects that threaten to recontaminate cleaned up sites in order to ensure the development of community assets are prioritized. In some cases, cleaning up contaminated sites can lead to whole new problems. High amounts of public investment without community protections can result in the displacement of existing communities, both residents and the local businesses they sustain. Private investment typically follows public investment to exploit the revitalization intended for existing communities, but instead only prioritize profit at the cost of community cohesion. This is why many have called for better neighborhoods, same neighbors. Through the Lower Alley River Revitalization Plan, a 21-mile stretch of communities riddled with contaminated sites identified by US EPA Region 9, we've been able to develop the Community Stabilization Toolkit, which includes community benefits agreements, inclusionary housing policies, locally owned business support, no net loss housing policies, rent control ordinances, community land trusts, and workforce development. Federal funding requirements can make these community stability programs and policies a requirement for funding, or at the very least include them in scoring criteria for funding applications in order to contribute to community stability instead of threatening it. And to drill down on local targeted hire and workforce development, we cannot underestimate the value of people cleaning up contaminated sites in their own neighborhoods. For one, this is a direct monetary investment in the community through targeted hire of local residents who are impacted by toxic contamination, as well as an investment in the economic future of communities through workforce development. There's an opportunity here to utilize the historical harms in communities to generate careers for those most impacted and infuse dollars directly into communities immediately. This is what we've seen with the Exide cleanup in my community. Not only has the state's Workforce for Environmental Restoration in Communities program trained and certified community members to literally remove poison from our communities shovel by shovel, but these workers have taken extra responsibility to call out the behavior of bad actors amongst contractors who seek to cut corners to maximize profit or operate with a culture of racism, sexism, and sexual harassment. And all of this is possible through community partnership. Local jurisdictions have limited capacity and authority. The rail yards between Exide and our homes remain contaminated beyond the reach of the state agency because of federal jurisdiction, which means every time the wind blows, our community is threatened. We also face limited vision and follow through of local jurisdictions because of turnover of staff and elected officials. Meanwhile, the memory of our communities allows us to look into the past before freeways cut up and displaced our communities, railroads changed the character of our neighborhoods, and toxic facilities poisoned generations of our families. We have had to build up and defend our communities, fill gaps, and build bridges between agencies because we are committed to fighting for life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez, for your insightful testimony. And our condolences to you for your loss of your grandfather. And Mr. Goldstein, I believe we share also condolences on your recent loss of a family member. Now we will move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. If there are additional questions, we may, not sure, may have additional rounds as necessary. I recognize Mr. Rouser. I'll let you go before me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Bodine, let me start with you. So what balance between federal, state, and local government roles do you see as being most effective in the redevelopment of brownfields or other contaminated sites? And along those lines, what can state and local governments do that the federal government may not be so well equipped to do?
Thank you, Congressman Rouser, for that question. So we're talking about the brownfields program. As I pointed out earlier, you're talking about sites that are not the national priority sites. And so they are being cleaned up under state programs. The standards, the cleanup standards are under state programs. And as is always true, the local governments control land use, they control what the redevelopment is. Now, what EPA's role is to provide seed money. And the statistics that Chair DeFazio quoted are incredibly impressive about how successful that seed money has been in then encouraging private investment. And I have to say, Dr. Wilson cited some very impressive statistics that came from an EPA summary from September of this year that points out that EPA's brownfields program, which Mayor Vinnis, she lauded the staff, and I would echo that. The staff there are fantastic. They are already directing the grants to areas with high poverty rates, high minority populations, low per capita income. So the statistics that he cited were the ones were EPA funded communities. So you see that direction because because that's as part of the grant guidelines, which Congress sets, the grant criteria, those are all considerations. But so what's important is for EPA to provide the tools, like the job training tools that Mr. Lopez talked about, and the community participation tools that I talked about with the various community assistance grants that are provided. But EPA doesn't make the decisions. They provide all these tools in the brownfields arena, and then it lets the local governments make the decisions. It lets the private investors come in.
Talking about grants, kind of along those lines, but a different form, tax credits in the Jobs Act. I'm thinking about the tax reform from a couple years ago. Senator Tim Scott had legislation that was included in that, basically tax credits for opportunity zones for those who invested in very low economically distressed areas. Has there been any overlap or are tax credits a good leveraging tool as well as grants for private investment? Just curious your thoughts on that.
Yes, yeah, there's been some, EPA has reported some very high successes of essentially marrying up the brownfield grants and having them in areas where there are also the opportunity zone tax credits, which are of course, you know, based on low income. And that has been extremely effective, as EPA reported, I think in their end of year 6 report last year, that marrying up those two programs together has resulted in very high investment.
Good to know. Mr. Shabazz, based on your experiences in your respective communities, how can investors be better incentivized to go into lower income and other underserved communities and invest in those areas? We've touched on that a little bit, but when we get your thoughts.
Well, we talked a little bit about the tax credits. We always see these opportunity zone experiences that incentivize developers to come into the process. But I think what we're looking for is from a community base is a more collaborative experience where an investor would embody themselves within a community in such a way that it's not just a one and done experience. I think there needs to be some kind of incentive, fiscal incentives where infrastructure within neighborhoods at a neighborhood level is realized as by way of the investment. So our objective is to create these collaborative partnerships where there's a fiscal agent that's incentivized to participate within the process of the brownfields, but doesn't necessarily walk away from the experience, but allows an infrastructural experience to stay behind so that the communities can continue to grow their own capacity. I think capacity building is a major part of that experience.
My time has expired, Madam Chair, or about to in 6 seconds, so I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. And I have a question for all witnesses. The bipartisan infrastructure law appropriated $1.5 billion. So that should take care of some of the needs of most of the areas that need contamination remediation. Although it's not enough, as my colleague and I were talking, we'll always ask for more because there are so many areas that need cleanup. But will it help address the backlog of critical assessment and cleanup work and speed up protection of human health and the environment? But how can we assure that the remediated properties are helpful, beneficial to the community and minorities, and don't create gentrification? Anybody?
I'm happy to jump in to begin with. I think we definitely have a list of projects that we would continue to invest in with this additional money. So it does help us move forward on our plans. We have, as many cities do, we have what we have is a former state highway that's become part of the city now, but it is an uncomfortable mix of industrial and residential. It has a brownfield. It could use investment, so we would use it in that way. We have also in our brownfields work in the developments that I cited 2 of them. Our city council by policy established sites for affordable housing. So we are focusing on using these development opportunities to help get ahead a little bit of our housing crunch, and particularly providing more affordable housing for our community. And one of those sites was we're redeveloping for a farmer's market, we're in an agricultural breadbasket. It's really important that we support our local farmers with a year-round market. So we've been very directed, and I think that's the value of having these partnerships where EPA provides these funds, but as Susan Bodine has pointed out, we have the capacity locally to create those zoning requirements and those policy directives to ensure that.
But that's when you have a great city council.
We do have a great city council.
Anybody else?
Can I chime in? Yeah, can I chime in? Yeah, really important points there. So I think when we look at bringing in, I think public health and equity have to be really kind of key tenets that we follow in doing this work. And so, there's this whole issue of the kind of the food, energy, water nexus, and what I want to mean by that is how do we build an infrastructure to, kind of move from unjust food infrastructure to just food infrastructure? We talked about affordable housing, right? We have issues in many of our communities because you think about the brownfields and the builtscape impervious surfaces. So if you think about the issue of climate change, it's the issue of heat islands plus the issue of runoff, stormwater runoff. So bringing in systems where we are actually designing, using the brownfields and other hardscape to create new community ecosystems where you provide greater access to food and housing, reduce the urban heat island issue, which would reduce heat morbidity and heat mortality for many of our cities. And also you deal with the stormwater issue. So I think you have to have a combination of looking at, these kind of urban sustainability initiatives, and zoning really matters. Zoning matters. So California passed SB 1000 a few years back to make sure that environmental justice principles were in the comprehensive plans. We have to have some better engagement with our local authorities around zoning and put in green zoning. And really a big part of this work, when we do all this investment in communities, if we are not addressing expulsion, if we are not addressing green gentrification, we're not doing our job. And that's a huge part of the work that we have to think about in the planning process. As Jerome said, that's why we have to have more meaningful involvement and engagement and authentically
But
other communities.
you've got to
will be served
educate
by
the
this.
communities first to be involved and how to get involved, and that's something that we don't do.
Exactly. So I'm gonna talk. I'll pass the mic, but the community engagement part is really important to make sure you have anti-gentrification in the beginning of the process, and it can't be at the back end; it has to be at the front end. Thank you.
Madam Chair, this is Michael Goldstein. First of all, I would like to endorse and affirm the comments made by the mayor and by Dr. Wilson. They're right on point. I'd like to offer a friendly amendment in this regard. The overriding concern, the abiding concern that we always have in a brownfields context with expulsion, with gentrification, can be addressed or can start to be addressed through the doubling down of the brownfields lifeblood, which is funneling limited public sector economic incentives to the private sector. In the state of Florida, the state puts its thumb on the scale for affordable housing by providing an increased corporate income sales tax credit tied to cleanup, as well as a sales tax refund on construction materials for affordable housing. So what I would suggest is that this subcommittee consider taking a look at the existing financial incentives and new financial incentives, such as perhaps a federal brownfields loan guarantee program, enhanced opportunity zone incentives, enhanced affordable housing, low-income housing tax credit incentives, as I suggested in my testimony, and tying those new incentives and enhanced existing incentives to a greater sense of responsibility.
Mr. Goldstein,
and
my
equity
time is up.
creation by the developers.
Would you mind very much submitting it to the committee?
I'm sorry?
Would you mind submitting that suggestion to the committee?
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
If I may, Madam Chair, in the last 30 seconds, specifically tying these enhanced incentives and new incentives to, as Dr. Wilson pointed out and the mayor pointed out, an increase in affordable housing, perhaps also in microlending, in job workshops, in preservation of cultural resources.
Thank you, sir.
Creation, and thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but my time ran wide over. Mr. Mast, you're on, please.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate it. And I want to speak directly to Ms. Bodine. It's good to see you again. I know we had the opportunity to speak recently and just was amazed with your depth of knowledge about a host of issues, given your background and the work that you've done. It raised, as I was preparing for this hearing, several questions about the Superfund program and brownfields and how they could relate to an environmental issue in the state of Florida. And as many on this committee have heard me deal with constantly, I know that you've done a lot of work on Everglades restoration and Lake Okeechobee during your time working in Congress. And as you're aware, Lake Okeechobee is an ecological disaster. Its water is too toxic to be sent into the Everglades. We know that there's tons and tons, layers of muck and fertilizer that are just sitting on the bottom of Lake Okeechobee and its canals out of there. These nutrients, they fuel very literally toxic algal blooms that are extremely toxic. And then you layer on top of those layers of fertilizer and toxic algal blooms another issue, and that is, let's take Roundup as one of the largest lawsuits in history in our country, the Roundup lawsuit, and literally tens of thousands of gallons of glyphosate or Roundup are sprayed year after year after year into these waterways of Lake Okeechobee. And so it's in that I want to say, what are the criteria for chemicals and hazardous substances for being put on the EPA's list of hundreds of chemicals? And where do you see those issues with Lake Okeechobee playing into this?
Thank you, Congressman. You're asking me a FIFRA question, which obviously regulates pesticide products. And there's been a lot of back and forth, I think, on glyphosate, and I'm not necessarily up to speed on exactly where that is, where the registration of that is. But as you were speaking, I was thinking about something that hadn't ever occurred to me before, which is there an overlay between the issues with Lake Okeechobee and, of course, with the northern estuaries, and is there an opportunity with perhaps the Brownfields program to lend assistance to that? And that's something I would have to think about and get back to you for the record, but there may be, because of course those are hazardous substances. They are released, they are causing environmental exposures and contamination. And so, based on that, I would think that, that would be eligible. And certainly there, as I pointed out in my testimony, those programs provide an enormous number of tools to local governments, as well as to local community groups to participate in processes and to understand. So the technical assistance and technical expertise that they provide can be huge assets as well to help people engage with the agencies on a suite of issues. So I would ask that I get back to you for the record on the more substantive response.
Yeah, I know you will. Obviously, you have not been bashful about speaking to folks, which is greatly appreciated. So in that, I think it is an interesting way to frame this conversation when you consider the Corps of Engineers, releasing toxic waters over 100 times greater than what the EPA said is too toxic for humans to come in contact with, essentially, doubling down on creating a new brownfield year after year after year, a new Superfund site year after year after year. And so in that, I would appreciate anything further you have on that. For any of our other witnesses here, there's still a minute remaining of my time. If you have a comment, I'm certainly happy to hear it. And I'll give if anybody wants to pipe in, and if not, I'll yield back at that point. Is there any other comments on this? I'll take that as a no. And Madam Chair, I will yield my time back.
Thank you, Mr. Mess, for your comments. And Ms. Johnson of Texas, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you also to the ranking member for holding today's hearing on efforts to address brownfields and other contaminated properties. I'd like to begin by giving a big shout out to the recognition of our chair, Mr. Peter DeFazio, whom I have had the honor to work with throughout my 30 years in Congress on this committee, and his leadership has been tremendous. And we wish him well for the future. Look forward to working with him another year. In my congressional district in Dallas, I worked diligently to obtain funding for a brownfield redevelopment project known as Victory Park in the downtown area. It was transformed from the brownfields program from an industrial wasteland populated by an old paint factory and a meat packing area plant, and now is a multi-billion-dollar mixed-use development that offers retail shops, restaurants, office space, residential units, hotels, and entertainment venues, including the American Airlines Center, which is the home of the Dallas Mavericks and Dallas Stars. Victory Park, which serves today as a national model, is a perfect example of a successful brownfields project where a decaying area had been converted into a vibrant economic and cultural center that produces employment and productivity in this depressed area. So I'd like to ask all of the witnesses, what do each of you believe is the #1 action item this committee and the Congress can do to replicate successful brownfield projects like the Victory Park in cities across the nation?
I'll jump in real quick, just to respond real quickly. I think there's opportunities to work, I think through the National Association of Mayors and potentially the National Black Mayors Association to engage with them to say how we can take that model that you just talked about. I looked it up online and basically have direct investments into those brownfields. So we can prioritize brownfield those cities, work with the mayors. Mayors can work with state agencies, state governments to replicate what's done. I'll add another example to what you said. Harold Mitchell's work with Regenesis in Spartanburg is another example of a community with brownfields and Superfund sites where they now have $300 million of investments with affordable housing, green housing, health centers, job development. So I think working through the Mayors Association, I think it's probably the first place to start to make sure that they understand these resources are available through the infrastructure, Build Back Better, Justice 40, and have a suite of funding that can go into those communities to replicate Victory Park.
Thank you. Mayor Venus, do you have any comment?
Well, I second Dr. Wilson's comments. I think he's exactly right. It's reaching out to mayors. I will also say I'm new to the EPA's Local Government Affairs Advisory Committee, and that is a very effective committee for reaching directly to cities and hearing what we need in order to implement and sharing those models. So that system already exists, and we can make the best use of it we can.
Yes.
If I might make a suggestion, Congresswoman. So we've heard both from Dr. Wilson and from Mr. Goldstein and from the mayor about success stories and the tools that the local government employed to achieve those successes. So not all of those are within the purview of Congress, but the committee could take on the gathering of that information. You know, what are the local government tools? What tools have been deployed at these various areas, including Victory Park, that led to the success? And then share that information not only with the Conference of Mayors, but also with the Local Government Advisory Committee as saying, look, there's some great tools out there that you control, and here's some suggestions.
Madam Congresswoman, I would like to add also, in addition to supporting everything that Dr. Wilson mentioned, that the regional offices of the EPA can do a better job of formulating more extensive goals and objectives. We're working with local communities. The same way we have the federal FACAs, there needs to be regional goals and objectives for collaborating and fulfilling the mission and objectives of communities. They have more regional-based relationships, and I think they should be more active, held more accountable to fulfilling the overall goals of the agency.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Mr. Lamalfa, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Ms. Bodine, a couple thoughts here is when we're talking about brownfields and Superfund revitalization, et cetera. And we've heard several comments during the testimony here on local involvement. So what could be, why is that key? What issues do you run into if you don't have local involvement and it's done by outsiders? And what would be the best way to improve that situation so that you're getting that local input? Certainly me being from a rural area, we find a lot of situations, whether it's, might be fire suppression or cleanup, et cetera. A lot more local input would be, I think, seemingly helpful. Please emphasize some of your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. So I agree completely that local involvement is incredibly important. It helps protect human health and environment because you understand the exposures, and that's why it's also tremendously important in the Superfund program. Because you're selecting the remedies in Superfund, EPA does that. But in the brownfields arena, it's tremendously important as well. And it is one of the criteria that EPA uses to decide where to give the grants. And that is the extent to which the grant applicant is ensuring that there is local involvement in both the reuse decisions and the cleanup decisions. And so, I mean, there is a recognition.
Well,
of
does it
course.
help shape the direction of what is going to go back in there? Let's say now, I guess that's what I'm drilling down to, is the locals probably maybe aren't worried so much about exactly how the cleanup is done, other than it gets done, but maybe it has to do with what's going to go in there. Like in my area, you have mining, you have timber, wood mills, and you have areas that have maybe treated timber, and treated lumber into different finished products, and had some brownfield experience because of that. So is the local input need bigger sway on what's going to go back in there? We've heard a lot of ideas about what needs to happen in these areas. What would that look like in a rural aspect?
So what EPA can do and has authority to do, and was within the purview of this committee's jurisdiction, is to provide the tools for that involvement. What EPA cannot do is control land use. I mean, that's not a federal function. That's not an authority under any of these statutes. EPA doesn't control land use. So, but providing that local involvement, the ability for the local communities to participate is key, so their voices are heard. But EPA can't come in and sweep down and say, this is what you're going to do with your land.
Well, okay, that sounds correct, or what people would want. Can you emphasize a little more on a rural angle again? What you had industries that years ago did things probably not correctly the way we see them now, but with this knowledge of how to do things much more cleanly going forward, whether it is wood treatment or just processing timber into lumber, or the type of mining we're going to need for the materials forward for more and more electrification, things like that. What can we be doing better to take these old sites and make them, not scare everybody to death, that we're going to start operating in the same old way, but turn these sites back into something modernized to produce these products going forward?
Yeah, so you do. So the cleanups need to be protective, to your point, and whether it needs to comply with federal and state laws, and that's all a given, whether it's Superfund or brownfields.
Right.
And then exactly what the activities on the land are going to be decided at the local level.
Do you find that if you're reclaiming these old lands, there might be an easier process to have this industry where it used to be, whereas, we know it's tough opening any kind of new milling facility or related in a new area. Is that a better incentive to revamp the old ones into a renewed industry?
In fact, that's another criteria for the brownfields grants, is to the extent to which the grant applicant wants to reuse existing infrastructure. That's the whole greenfields versus brownfields issue. And it is important, and as I think one of the witnesses talked about, it helps with climate change issues. You're not out there getting into greenfields, you're reusing what's already there. And so that is a consideration as well. These are,
okay, real quickly too, I'm sorry on this time biz here. Does that then qualify as gentrification or expulsion if you're taking an area that has had little value and revaluing it in something, and now that might affect super low rent areas? Is that now turning into a gentrification issue?
I have read people call that gentrification. I do think, though, that when you're talking about bringing jobs back into a community, that's a good thing, and that you're increasing the tax base of the community, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. I'm sorry these 5 minutes go by so fast. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Lamalfa, for your testimony, and Ms. Bourdain. Ms. Bordeaux, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano and Ranking Member Rouser, for holding today's hearing. Since coming to Congress, I've advocated for policies that reinvest in infrastructure and maximize existing programs while also being good stewards of Americans' tax dollars. It's clear from today's testimony that the EPA's Superfund and Brownfields program have proven to be very important tools for localities to revitalize and redevelop their communities. Studies have shown that shopping malls can be successfully repurposed and revitalized to become drivers of growth and revenue in their community. So a slightly different issue, but one that's very, very important in my community. Earlier this year, I introduced the Grayfield Redevelopment and Economic Advancement through Economic Repurposing, or the Greater Revitalization of Shopping Centers Act, which builds on a proven model of grant subsidies in conjunction with Section 108 loan guarantees to incentivize public and private investment in abandoned and underutilized shopping malls. So while this is not directly about superfunds or brownfields, the principle is really quite similar. And the idea is that by investing federal dollars in our communities, the seed money that can drive additional private investment in economic growth and development. So along those lines, Mayor Venice, if you can speak a bit about how the federal investments in your community through the EPA grants have helped revitalize parts of Eugene, and talk a bit about some of the different financing tools that are available to partner and work with the federal funds in order to promote this kind of redevelopment.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'm knowledgeable about part of this and probably not the expert on other parts of it. So I'll answer where I can. You know, I mean, we have used these EPA grants. I gave 3 examples, and all 3, I mean, this former industrial site that we're redeveloping that will be a park and affordable housing, market rate housing, and a hotel and restaurant space. It's been an industrial site since the late 19th century, and you know, hasn't been redeveloped because of the anxiety of potential investors. So it has given us an opportunity to actually connect our downtown to the river for the first time in a way that's accessible by walking, by biking, and just visually accessible. So it is also enabling us to build a neighborhood next to our downtown, which is part of our way of being able to create a more thriving downtown, is to have more people living there and shopping there. And especially as we've come through the pandemic and seeing the impact. So that's profoundly important. And I also had mentioned a farmer's market, wanting to support our local farmers being able to sell their products year round, create more stability. And they provided a valuable food, again, outdoor market through the pandemic. So these redevelopments are critically important. And I think as we look, and I think those partnerships, that this sort of intersection between what we do in terms of developing unused and contaminated land and being able to build affordable housing, that kind of relationship with HUD and with HUD dollars is valuable. So Michael Goldstein's comments about increasing the capacity to invest in housing is really a key issue for us in terms of being able to provide more supports. I am not the person to answer the question on a lot of other specific financing tools. So I will defer that to the people in my city staff who know what tools they've used and how they've been the most effective.
Okay, thank you. And I just, when I have worked in these projects in Georgia, there's tax allocation districts or tax increment financing that could be used, community improvement districts. There are different partnerships with the local level. So I am curious about how these deals are put together. Just briefly in the remaining time, Mr. Shabazz, can you talk a little bit about how the federal investment helped revitalize your community as well?
What's interesting, Representative, is that the 2018 Builds Act was implemented in 2019. It was only from that time that nonprofits were able to actually receive funding from EPA to do cleanup grants. And so it hasn't been a long time that nonprofits have had the ability to seek direct funding from the EPA, in which it reflects is the lack of capacity that many organizations have to do so. We've been able to benefit and leverage our EPA funding to attract more statewide funding around infrastructural development, around community development. We're fortunate enough to be on a commercial corridor, and that commercial corridor enables us to attract very specific targeted resources that are on the state level designed to do redevelopment work and increase revenue and job opportunities in the neighborhoods. The other factor is that with WEJAC, the White House's Environmental Justice Council, it should be a greater interagency approach.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think my time has expired. Sorry about that. My time has expired. Thank you so much for talking about that, and I yield back.
That's no problem. Thank you, Ms. Bordeaux. Ms. Norton. Ms. Norton. We'll go forward to Ms. Stanton. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Lopez, who I'm proud to say provides important work to my community and in my district, especially in Long Beach. I'm going to reiterate what you've said and how people who have been exposed to contaminated sites deserve a clean and safe environment, but they also deserve to benefit from the cleanup, to make up for the harms that they have suffered. And you have touched upon this, Mr. Lopez, in your testimony, but there are two things I'd like you to elaborate. Can you elaborate on your community stabilization toolkit? Let us know a little bit more about that toolkit. And the second part of that question is, how can we here in Washington work with you to make sure that frontline communities receive the full benefits of community redevelopment funding? So my first one is, talk to us about that, more about the community stabilization toolkit.
Thank you, Representative Lowenthal. Yeah, I mean, when we came together for the Lower LA River Revitalization Plan, we're talking about, maybe a dozen local jurisdictions plus an array of other agency and nonprofit leaders to really envision a revitalization of this 21-mile stretch and corridor, right? And I think in that process, it really allowed us to consider multiple perspectives about essentially unintended consequences, right? We want to do what's best, and how do we ensure that we do that without creating these kind of gaps for our community members to fall through, to be excluded from, or be essentially subjected to displacement, right? And so that's where we came up with the toolkit, because what we found was there really isn't one, silver bullet solution to ensuring community stability. We actually need an array of programs and policies that fit together to create this essentially infrastructure policy-wise and programmatically to ensure that community members are directly benefiting and aren't being harmed in the process. And what you see here really is, as was mentioned before, something that really, because the land use authority does lie with the local jurisdiction, I think the opportunity that you all have at the federal level is when it comes to funding, right? So the opportunity to make some of these programs and policies requirements, or again, at the very least, part of the scoring criteria that essentially could nudge or encourage local jurisdictions to activate these policies and programs in order to be more competitive for federal funding, is the approach that you all can take. And I think as far as engaging local communities, the reality is a lot of these contaminated sites are things that communities have been fighting against already, right? In many cases, they're brownfields because the former toxic companies is something that community members were aware of, that community members were working inside of. And so we'll have the best perspectives on what the impacts are and what the solutions are, right? And I think whether we're talking about an urban context or a rural context where there may not be as much community infrastructure, I think when you look at those who are most directly connected to the issues, you're going to find some of the most sensible solutions for how to move forward. I think that's how you ensure that because when you encourage and you support community involvement, you're supporting a constituency that's gonna stay engaged until beyond the execution of the actual cleanup and whatever comes in the future, right? Folks are invested all the way through.
I just have a few seconds left, basically. And I think you've touched on it, but I just want to make sure you feel like you've fully answered it. How do we partner together, the federal government and frontline communities? What's the best way for us? You mentioned the funding, but what else?
Yeah, looking to the regions across the country to identify who's already active, but also to support communities where maybe, again, there isn't existing nonprofit infrastructure in order to ensure that community members have a voice in this, right? And so sometimes that's looking at communities who maybe are new to cleanup of environmental sites, but maybe who have a history and legacies of fighting contaminators in our communities is where you're going to open up a new lane for a new constituency to really infuse energy and innovation into this area.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Appreciate your participation. Mr. Denton, proceed. You may proceed.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. Thank you for holding this important hearing. I want to say thank you to all of our witnesses today. This has been a very informative hearing. The bipartisan infrastructure law makes historic investments that will accelerate the pace of Superfund and brownfield cleanups projects across our country. In addition, the law waives cost-sharing requirements for both of these programs, which will help states, tribal communities, and localities advance projects without worrying about having to come to the table with resources when budgets are already stretched so thin at the local level. My state of Arizona has 9 Superfund sites on the national priorities list, which means the Environmental Protection Agency has deemed these sites as posing the greatest threat to public health and to our environment. Yet one of the challenges I have heard from stakeholders in my state is the lack of staff at EPA to move these projects forward. Region 9, which includes Arizona, has had many staff and highly technical roles retire or depart the agency for other opportunities. As a result, the remediation project managers are now carrying double, sometimes triple the workload of Superfund sites that they were just a few years ago. Unfortunately, this is causing delays in the reviews of technical work and ultimately implementation of remedies at these critical sites. In order to get these infrastructure investments working as quickly as possible, it is important that the EPA is fully staffed at all levels. In addition, I believe the resources provided under the law should be prioritized for cleanup of contaminated groundwater in the Southwest. Groundwater is a critical resource, and as a mega drought in the Southwest persists, it is essential that we focus cleaning up groundwater supplies to help our communities weather these challenges. Cleaning this groundwater not only helps us secure our water future, it, and perhaps most importantly, helps us better protect public health. So I have questions for Mayor Vettis. Mayor Vettis, multi-purpose grants under the Brownfields program are essential in assisting local governments respond effectively and quickly to redevelopment needs. The bipartisan infrastructure law increases the per grant amount substantially up to $10 million. Based upon experiences in your community, how do you think this change will benefit the program and the ability of local governments to address brownfield sites in your communities?
Thank you so much. I guess I could say it very briefly and say more is always better. I think that local in our local context, we're looking to have as much. We do have a backlog. We have sites that we wish to address. We have multiple goals that we're trying to accomplish with these brownfields grants in order to both create some job opportunities, to create housing that we need, to create an opportunity for commercial centers, the sites that we still need to work on, are sites in which we want to see. We want to see more retail and commercial action as well as housing. So those multi-purpose grants enable us to sort of tie those together. We're looking at climate goals and clean air issues also in those neighborhoods. So the intersection, and then of meeting, our lower income communities, communities of color who have been disproportionately impacted and underserved. So that capacity at a local level to be able to knit all those goals together with a grant are incredibly valuable to us.
That's great. Thank you, Mayor, very much. Mr. Goldstein, the bipartisan infrastructure law waives the cost share for grants under the Brownfields program. From your perspective, how important is the cost share waiver for helping to advance brownfields cleanup, particularly in tribal and other underserved communities?
Underserved communities, Congressman, typically have barriers to accessing any types of capital, any amounts of capital. So waiving of the cost share is super critical. It's almost existential for not-for-profits and for rural communities, and certainly for tribal nations. Getting back, Congressman, to the question you posed to the mayor, the higher caps on brownfield grants is wonderful for those who receive the grants. Of course, that means that there's less money to go around, which is why you've heard a couple of times from the witnesses that the grant program should continue, the magnitude of the grant program should be increased overall. What I would like to suggest is that the easiest way to diminish the workload on EPA is to facilitate the transition of Superfund sites into the private sector by creating additional incentives to encourage public sector investment in the acquisition of Superfund sites, so that the cleanup, the redevelopment, the reuse devolves to the private sector and the local government through the land use oversight process. And at the same time, that allows EPA to step back and concentrate on other priorities. So increase grant funding overall, in addition to the caps, that's number one. Number two, create new economic incentive programs to attract more private sector investment, because private sector dollars follow public sector dollars. And then create an even more streamlined regulatory process to allow the oversight of Superfund cleanups to be deferred to state environmental agencies and local environmental agencies.
Thank you very much. Excellent answer. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Huffman, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for their perspectives on the relative success of these cleanup projects and how we can help frontline communities not just ensure that they're safe from toxic contamination, but also make sure that properties are redeveloped to provide lasting and good paying jobs that support communities who've been burdened by these toxic legacies. So I represent something of a success story to the extent that we can use the word success when we're talking about a Superfund site that generated emergency cleanup costs 5 times higher than original estimates, with the original responsible corporate polluter managing to pass the bill on to taxpayers and the local community. But nonetheless, there is a measure of success in what we've done at the 72-acre Samoa pulp mill in Humboldt County. The cleanup of caustic liquors at this site was successful. And we certainly remain aware that we may need to monitor, we do need to monitor and address longer-term subsurface contamination threats. But due to the location of this facility, a commercially vibrant harbor, many companies were eager to move into the location, and more could be on the way. So it's a qualified success, thanks to the $15 million investment we received from the EPA to clean up this site. I realize, though, that many other communities are not so lucky. We know that with many polluting sites, including landfills, toxic dumps, we're talking about low-income communities that, for the very reason they often don't have the political voice to push back against these projects, it's hard for them to come forward and achieve cleanup and remediation, even with federal assistance. They remain derelict properties and concentrated in areas of poverty that are challenging for attracting new commercial development. So Mr. Shabazz, I appreciate your testimony, sharing with the committee what you and others are doing in collaboration and partnerships to ensure that these sites are cleaned up in an equitable, sustainable fashion that works for communities who have been hardest hit by this pollution. You talk about the public health challenges of Overbrook and West Philadelphia, as well as other challenges like limited digital access. I wonder if you could just speak a little more on how your work and the work of others have contributed not just to cleaning up pollution, but stimulating economic development through job creation, workforce development, and public health improvements.
Thank you very much, Representative Huffman. The issue that we're constantly talking about in this discussion is that there's a lack of capacity in the frontline communities. And we need to be very intentional around creating infrastructure to help neighbors and community members and frontline communities, fence line communities, to have the capacity not only to understand the issues, but to be able to see how it matters with their participation in the issue. And then most importantly, what the outcomes look like for sustainable development within communities. From that perspective, it enables us to be able to do a better job with planning around job opportunities and potential infrastructural developments that would benefit the lives of the community members that these brownfield sites are residing within. You know, nonprofits are often expected to be the go-to organizations for community input across local planning efforts without being compensated for their expertise and time. And so what happens is that the nonprofits and the frontline communities don't have the resources to engage in the charrettes and don't have the opportunity to engage in the true planning process. But if they were able to do so, what it would do is to create this sort of knowledge capacity experience that talks about what the needs are moving forward. And then we can include from the Brownsfields to Greensfields experiences where we can identify some of the issues relative to climate, to water mitigation, to heat mitigation, the heat island effects. That only happens when community members are involved. And the economic developments are clear. We're usually in communities that are not wealthy communities, and they need to have the opportunity to grow and learn. What we've been doing with Overbrook is taking our Brownsfields experience to the community in such a way where they can learn about it. We've created opportunities and jobs around the EPA's RRP program, where the contractors learn about the mitigation of lead and other kinds of toxic amenities. The issue is making sure we have the capacity for communities to get involved.
Appreciate that, Mr. Shabazz. Thanks very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman, for your asking those very important questions, the witnesses. Mr. Carvajal, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses that are here today. There are several success stories of brownfields being cleaned up and turning from toxic, unsafe pieces of land into something that serves the local community. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act authorizes $1.5 billion, as was said earlier, for brownfield cleanups. These funds give communities the opportunities to improve their quality of life by reducing health risks and expanding economic opportunity. Mr. Lopez, you talk about the benefits of having the affected communities be actively involved in the cleanups and utilizing a local workforce to invest directly in the economic future of area communities. Can you elaborate how a local workforce was recruited in the situation that you've discussed?
Yes, thank you, Representative Carvajal. In our case, essentially, the state agency was able to partner with the local trade school. This is an area that our community members already look towards in order to receive the training and certification to be able to seek better employment opportunities. And so resources were dedicated to develop a pilot program at the trade school. LA Trade Tech is the name of the school. and train cohorts of community members, essentially to be able to learn and understand the work, again, be trained, and most importantly, be certified to do the work, because we're talking about handling of hazardous substances, and sometimes paying for this type of certificate becomes a barrier to lower income communities being able to access these future employment opportunities. And so what this did is it created a base for community members to be able to enter this employment. And so the way most people found out about it was from those of us who had been fighting to shut down this bad actor for years and generations. And so it was community members who were already aware of this toxic polluter. In some cases, it was the very people whose homes needed to be cleaned up because lead had been contaminating their homes for decades. And so these are, again, our folks who are directly impacted by the contamination, who now have prevailing wages, sometimes double what they were previously making in other employment opportunities. And it really just changes the trajectory of families in our communities when we're able to access these types of employment opportunities.
Thank you very much. It has been well documented that lower income communities and racial minorities are disproportionately exposed to environmental harm. There are concerns that development of brownfields can do unintended harm by displacing the people who live there as well. Dr. Wilson, what steps do you think the EPA should take to prevent residents from being displaced?
Thank you for that question, Representative. I've been waiting to talk. I've been like, I wanted to say something, but thank you for that. What's really interesting is, as I said earlier, anti-gentrification, has to be part of, the process. And I think when you look at this, redevelopment, as Jerome has said, it has to be community driven, everyone. We need to change the ecosystem of redevelopment. We have to change the ecosystem revitalization. And sometimes that word is problematic because some communities were never vitalized, right? So what are we getting them back to? We want to build back better. We want to build them back better, if that makes sense, y'all. So when you're talking about gentrification, bringing in smart growth principles, having social equity, President Biden has 2 racial equity executive orders. Taking that language of executive orders and making sure you have social equity in the redevelopment, revitalization process, and requiring that, whether it be through economic empowerment zones, opportunity zones, TIFs, having some additional guardrails to make sure you don't displace. As Mr. Lopez said, I think he said you want to make sure you build a neighborhood better, but with the same people, right? So how do you do that? You have to have extra guardrails. I would just say real quickly that if you look at Executive Order 14008, the whole Justice 40 initiative, 40% of the benefits should go to disadvantaged communities. What we're saying, use that principle, 40% of these dollars, the investments and benefits, ecological, economic, environmental health benefits should go to the communities that have been dumped on and left behind. So you got to have guardrails, right? And it needs to be community driven, equity boards, planning boards, et cetera. And I'll stop there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. Ms. Norton, you are recognized. Ms. Norton, you're muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes. My first question is for Mayor Lucy Venice. As the only representative for the District of Columbia, I work closely with our mayor of the district on infrastructure priorities. That makes me especially interested in hearing your perspective as a city mayor. Based on the accomplishments of the Brownsfields program in your city of Eugene, Oregon, can you explain how cities can best leverage partnerships among federal and local governments, private sector stakeholders, and local residents to help their communities take advantage of the Brownsfield program?
Thank you so very much for that question. And I will just say I'm a former resident of Washington, D.C. before I moved to Eugene, so I have a great appreciation for the city and your longtime leadership there. I neglected to mention in an earlier question that two of our brownfield projects are within our downtown urban renewal districts. So we have used tax increment financing to leverage those activities. And I will also say that the riverfront development that I have mentioned is actually connected to a Franklin Boulevard corridor, transit corridor, which also received funding through this infrastructure bill to be a multimodal corridor. So we are looking at creating a landscape in which we have active transportation, we have transit investments, we are investing in affordable housing, we are creating a landscape with both these urban renewal districts to create a landscape that invites private investment, that creates a landscape that's attractive to that private investment. And of course, we all know that improving the brownfields creates a kind of a known quality of land so that it encourages people to invest. And I think that sort of public commitment to this array of transportation, housing, and the quality of that land. We have invested in that, our downtown urban renewal district, also in broadband. So we're trying to create a landscape that invites development, and that has happened for us. One of these brownfields that was former parking lots is the largest private development we have ever had in the city of Eugene.
That's something for all of us to learn from. Thank you for that response. Dr. Wilson, you use a term I hadn't heard before, environmental gentrification, in your testimony. You use it to describe racial and economic disparities that have been documented near brownfield sites, as well as the inequitable remediation of these sites. Many of us are now familiar with the idea of gentrification, but less attention is paid on how that idea applies to the cause of environmental justice, which is why this hearing is so important. Can you explain what characteristics of traditional gentrification are present in environmental gentrification, and how, if at all, environmental gentrification is different?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. So if you think about gentrification, and you have development that occurs where property values go up, you may have a high population of renters, rents go up. And so what you have is a process of explosive zoning planning development. So the population who, when you have the waterfront redevelopment, we have the new boutique shops and new malls that are built, right? You may have some land displacement of folks. You may also have, this is a very important point, small business displacement as well. Don't want to forget about the small business displacement. So it's just not when you have a residential displacement, you can have a component of small business displacement as well when we have this process of revitalizing, redeveloping brownfields or gray fields or brownfields to green fields. And with the population who live near those activities, who host those brownfields, who host those fund sites, are not able to really be engaged in the process. And as I said before, they get priced out and pushed out. So we have to have anti-gentrification measures in place in advance of any planning of a brownfield redevelopment project, any planning of a Superfund project, any plans when we're doing community development. We have to have that in place. And just for, think about DC, look at Ivy City neighborhood, right? Look what's happening in Brentwood neighborhood. Look what, Ward 7 and 8, right? Look at Buzzard Point community. Look in Prince George's County. We have things that are happening. I live in Prince George's County, Maryland, where we want to make sure that as we green communities, we don't price out and push out the folks who were left behind because they had toxic hazards there, or didn't have affordable housing, or they had, a contaminated Anacostia River, or they may have, lack of access to food infrastructure. So I could go on and on, but thank you for the question. I'll pass the mic back.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. I appreciate that. Mr. Rouser, do you have any further comments, sir?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I didn't initially think that I had anything further I wanted to ask, but I do have this thought that's hit me here towards the end. One is, Yeah, how do you define success? And I don't come from this, I'm not coming at this from an adversarial perspective, but you know, we've got programs that seem to work pretty well. There's a lot of added investment that's being made, which is good. I'm just curious from the panelists, you know, across the board, whoever may want to respond, how exactly do we define success? In the construct of these programs, and then in terms of the greater social aspect that's trying to be achieved here.
Representative, this is Jerome Shabazz. If I
Sure.
can tell you a brief story of a gentleman who was in a wheelchair when we started doing some of our cleanup work. He came to the back of his door and started clapping. And we had no idea why this gentleman was clapping. And we walked over to him and asked him, "Why are you clapping?" He said, "For 50 years, I've been watching this contamination. I thought no one would help. I thought no one cared enough to make a difference." And so success for us is for this gentleman, not only himself, but for his family and for his children, to no longer have to coexist with contamination, waste, and hazards that are derogatory to their health, to their quality of life, and most importantly, their worldview. His children, his grandchildren grew up with dust and deterioration and this kind of blight that it shaped their sense of what community is all about. Our idea ultimately for us as an organization is to make sure that we can help restore the dignity of people's lives, and so that they can have a very viable and reliable future and coordination with their government. And they should expect to be able to live in peace and to live in a healthy environment. And so I think the success of these programs is not only that outsider developers can come in and establish a more viable, economically viable use of lands, but so that the indigenous community members can do so themselves. There are 5 tracts that are close to the properties that we've developed in Lancaster Avenue in Philadelphia, where if they were redeveloped, it would represent 13 acres of land. 13 acres of land is adjacent to properties that would not even compare in measurement. And those people would be displaced, outplaced, and outsourced if they didn't have any kind of viable way to coordinate and be a part of the developmental process of these brownfields. So I think for us, the success is allowing people to live in dignity, to be a part of the process, and to be able to grow in place and not have to be forced out just to be able to stay healthy and clean.
Ms. Modine, do you have any thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, sorry. So I would look in the Superfund program. Success is the success in protecting human health and environment by addressing the hazardous substances. So it's removing or cutting off exposure to hazardous substances. That makes sites ready and available for reuse, and the reuse can be anything from butterfly gardens to to playgrounds to industrial redevelopment. In brownfields, it is different. The success, it's statistics that we've heard a couple times here, including from Chair DeFazio. The success is really in providing enough federal seed money to leverage the private investment. So you are, I think the stats were something like every dollar of brownfields money results in $20 in private investment. So EPA looks at that as a success as well as the jobs. And of course, the criteria for giving those grants includes the issues that we've talked about today, like local participation. And then, of course, the point EPA says it has authorities that allow them to bring home some of those benefits from cleanup, like providing the drop training. That's both in the Superfund program and the Brownfields program, so that locals can get like the HAZWOPER certification that one of the witnesses talked about, so they can get the jobs. So all of that, so jobs, the number of jobs is success, both the new jobs and the cleanup jobs. The leveraging is a success, and then of course, eliminating the exposure to hazardous substances is the success.
Thank you. Anybody else have a thought or two?
Yeah, this is Michael Goldstein. I would like to affirm and amplify the comments of the prior witnesses by saying this: success can be measured emotionally and narratively in the way previously described, but also numerically, and both are equally important to demonstrate to the private sector that these types of challenging projects are investment worthy. You can look at reduction in chemical types and chemical concentrations. As Ms. Bodine suggested, the additional number of new permanent jobs and temporary jobs for construction, increase in property values, the number of projects surrounding the subject property where redevelopment has occurred, the nature and number and types of collaborative partnerships that occur between local stakeholders, local governments, and private developers. We can go on. EPA does a wonderful job at tracking these metrics to demonstrate a very meaningful return on investment to the public and the public treasury. And if there's one last parting observation I would make, it's that EPA is doing a spectacular job, a sublime job in discharging both its responsibility and obligation as someone who wields the construction hammer and the sheriff's badge. They're balancing their enforcement obligation with their redevelopment ethic in a way that's effective and innovative and reassuring and inspiring. And I think that's worthy of being recognized too.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosso. That was very interesting. Just the same, I'd like to ask Mr. Lopez an important point. When redevelopment does happen on contaminated sites, the community should have a say in the redevelopment so that it is not another polluting facility and creating jobs that are still polluting. Can you explain further your concern? And if anybody wants to join in, how local coordination and buy-in can result in cleanup efforts, especially in training. I like the idea of having training classes for the local community to participate. And Mr. Lopez, I like all your points on the stabilization toolkit. Mr. Lopez?
Thank you, Chair Napolitano. Yes. Here in the Los Angeles area, and I think in most port communities across the country, again, inland ports and also seaports, what we're seeing is large areas of commercial and industrial land being purchased and utilized specifically for warehousing. And so what this does at the local level, it essentially displaces career opportunities for temp jobs that pay low wages. And because they carry such a large footprint, that's what prevents future development of other types of industries that can provide careers for our community members. Additionally, because we're looking at what are primarily diesel trucks that are servicing these facilities, the pollution that community members are exposed to comes with a greater health risk. And I think additionally, when we're looking at this process and kind of connecting to the green gentrification that was mentioned earlier, it is kind of a slap in the face for communities to have had to deal with these issues, often be the advocates to resolve these issues, and then not be able to get the benefits, right? And so that's what we're experiencing here in our communities, and I think that's where when we measure success, I think there's lots of metrics, but at the end of the day, success is measured, is defined by communities because it's experienced by communities. And so we look at
I'm sorry, but sometimes the community cannot speak for itself because they're not able to because of language difficulties. So how do we overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue, but that's where when we have a representative, when we have staff of agencies that is able to be come from experiences from these communities, and of course, language access is always a priority for us. And when we have existing community infrastructure to support each other in cases where agencies have gaps, is where we've seen the most success to be able to bring all constituents to the table to have an investment and a say in what moves forward.
Very good. Well, and also decisions when the companies decide to go bankrupt to avoid financial responsibility, what changes do we need to make sure they are held responsible?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, unfortunately, bankruptcy court really privileges corporate entities at a disadvantage to our communities and taxpayers who often have to come in and essentially pay the way. And so I think what is really needed is earlier action from federal, state, and local agencies who have the authorities around contaminating facilities, whether it's air, water, or land, toxics, to ensure compliance up front, right? To ensure that these don't become legacy issues in our communities, but then to create action while the companies are still fully operating to ensure that this isn't an issue that we're dealing with 30, 40, 50 years down the line, once a company has been able to restructure and sever its liabilities, which essentially is contamination in our communities.
Thank you very much. Anybody else have any comment? If not, then I thank all the witnesses for all their participation and members of Congress who were with us. And I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered. I am very grateful to all the witnesses and to the members for their participation today. I think it was quite a hearing dealing with one of the blights in our areas. But if there and no other members have anything to add, the committee stands adjourned. And thank you very much again.